folks, Jeff here again. I guess this is still an episode of Iterative Refinement, but in our special World Cup mode. Again, I am joined by some special guests for this edition. We have... do you introduce yourself?
I'm Naranzul.
Robert?
I'm Robert. I'm a co-founder of C-Proof AI and one of the researchers here.
Great. Thanks for joining, folks. And so, as a recap, we are today talking about World Cup. And we've been talking about World Cup over a couple of videos in long form and a bunch more short form. And this is because it's an interesting problem. We started looking at this really from the context of Kelly Bench, which is a benchmark on English Premier League betting from the folks at General Reasoning. And then we talked to a few experts. We did some of our own data exploration and experimentation. And then as the tournament's gone on, we've watched some games, we've looked at some data, we have some conclusions. And now here we are on Monday the 20th, and at long last, the tournament is over. We know who's won, we know who's lost, we know the upsets, we know the surprises. And so let's look back and see a little bit of what we've learned before we start to talk about more of the tech side of things. Let's talk about the tournament itself. Now, I don't recall you picking Spain. Do you feel like a bunch of other people picked Spain? Do you feel like they were a favorite towards the end there?
Yeah, just looking at the betting market, I think Spain was favorite to win, about, I believe, like 42%. And Argentina was about 26%. Somehow along the tournament, many people just didn't want Argentina to win at all.
Yeah, I wonder how much of that is real odds and how much of that is people are like, I really would like Spain to beat Argentina, because I have not spoken to a single person who wanted Argentina to win.
Yeah, as far as I could tell, this particular island was entirely in favor of whoever could beat Argentina. So it's interesting to hear the narrative around the betting markets. There was a lot of interesting narratives around what people were really excited about in this tournament, not just in the championship, but in several of those later rounds. Now, is any of the rest of the stuff you saw from this part of the tournament?
Well, besides the tournament, I really wanted to see Justin Bieber's halftime performance, his World Cup Hallelujah. Yeah, that was exciting.
Okay. Justin Bieber making new soccer fans out of people around the world. I think last episode we had our picks there, and I picked overall England, given that there are no North American teams left in. Now, as you picked Norway, didn't survive.
Yeah, it's okay. I ended up rooting England afterwards.
Came in at a respectable third place. Respectable third. Robert, I don't think you were on the video where we asked this question, but at any point did you feel like you were solidly invested in any of those narratives that didn't play out in the data? Some team that maybe had heart, but not the skills to carry it over the line?
Of the underdog teams, honestly, for me, it's way more fun just to be like, yeah, let's see how far Cote d'Ivoire can go. They're probably not going to win, but let's see Norway make it to the semifinals, the quarterfinals. That's what I like to see. But did enjoy how poorly Argentina seemed to play in the final. Was kind of interesting for me.
Because usually after the halftime or the last 15 minutes, Argentina just gets really cracked. But it wasn't for this case. They were playing a little bit off on the finals.
I mean, they had like 2 shots on goal?
Yeah, it was really extreme. You look at the stats of like how much offensive pressure Spain was able to put on versus Argentina. It's very unpredictable stuff. I think there were definitely middle round exciting underdog narratives that people really liked. Norway was a big one. I think the rowing meme helped. Egypt seemed to grab a lot of fans, which I think is cool. It's not a highly ranked team, but they had some enthusiasm behind them for a while. Anything else from the tournament proper before we dive into a little bit more of the math and data, Naz? Any other recollections looking back on fun events from the tournament?
Well, for England versus France, I thought that was a really wholesome game. It seems like a friendly match. Yeah, I just love to see that.
Yeah, England and France love to have a rivalry that is sometimes polite and sometimes less polite. So I thought the England-France one was interesting because as we're going to talk about things like magnitude, as we talk about what models understand about games. As a non-soccer expert, 4-6 doesn't sound like a soccer score to me. I didn't understand that you could actually have a semifinal or third place round game turn out that way. That wouldn't even have been something I would have predicted, but I guess it's possible.
Yeah, I think it's weird to have what is effectively a friendly match in the middle of a knockout tournament where both of these teams are going home. They both already lost. And one of the players on the French team could get the award for most goals scored if he just scores a crazy number of goals in this game. And yeah, so that one feels like they set it up in a way that's like the match is going to be weird and anomalous.
Yeah, I think that's part of the entertainment value and truly just not knowing the outcome on some of these things, even though this is a tournament where the team that was predicted to be strong turned out to be strong. That's the final data point, but there's a lot of other less intuitive data points along the way. So I think that's a nice segue into our discussion of the analytics of this. And so just to establish more context for folks watching and listening, we did spend some time building out our understanding of the ways in which current generation LLMs do and don't do things right with trying to predict how games are going to turn out. Putting it in a betting context, mostly to just have a task frame for things. And we had a lot of observations. I'm going to let Robert, you lead on a lot of this, but I'm just going to establish some context for folks on what's in the box here. So we let agents do a lot of things, like get access to historical data on performance to see what happened in previous rounds, to get the current market odds. They had access and to be able to write code and run it against the things that were known to be true about what bets you could place and so forth. And we discovered a lot of things that just not that easy to steer what is supposedly these great models and make it possible for them to do the job right. So let's talk a little bit about what some of those observations were. Robert, where do we want to start with this weird thing that the Kelly Bench paper calls the intent to action mismatch?
Yeah. We see a lot. The models have a fairly good understanding of what at least moderate or high quality, like betting algorithm they could implement is. They're all familiar with Kelly staking. They all know that that's relatively optimal. Sometimes they even write pretty good code. And then there's just this weird disconnect where in part of this process, they'll just write what seems like a decent model, and then they will just not plug it in to the other thing they wrote, and they just won't even run it. Or they'll start with a pretty good model, and then they'll just abandon it partway through. So there is this disconnect we see a lot between what the models are framing as their intent and then literally what they actually do 5 seconds later, even with all of this stuff in their own context window, where I literally just said I was going to do X, and then I just implemented that. And then going forward, they just totally dropped the ball on that.
Yeah, I think this is something that the general reasoning team called out in their launch video for the Kelly Bench, which every so often you'll see an LLM say something like, yeah, I should do Kelly staking, and then not, which is really weird. It's perhaps one of the less anthropomorphic aspects of the LLMs, how much they forget to do the thing they said they were going to do. In a preceding video to this, Dawa Osinga was talking about how much the models perceive of themselves as human, but it, to me, feels really, really ragged. There was no interruption. No one called the LLM. Its baby wasn't screaming. The dog wasn't barking at the door. There was no reason for it to drop the ball, and yet it did.
Yeah. We see stuff where they're like, is this probability distribution that I'm going to get going to be between 0 and 100 or 0, 1? And they'll literally say things like, I should double check. And then they just pick one and then write code as if that's true. You could just look, you have this data. Or they'll say things like, okay, the expected goals per match. So this value is probably between 0.5 and 1. When you actually have the historic World Cup data, you could look from the last World Cup and see that this is way too low of an assessment, or your model produces 5% of the group stage matches as draws, when in all of the historic data you have, it's notably higher than that. They're just kind of lazy. They just don't check these things.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think in some of these cases, these are examples of tasks you could assign. If you supervised and you spent all this time hovering over the LM, you could tell it, pull the historical amount. What is the average amount of draws in the group stage? But if you don't really keep your eye on the ball, I definitely saw models doing things like predicting a certain percentage of draws in knockout rounds. After doing all of this work to build the entire structure of what is a knockout round, a model would still go forth and say, yeah, I think there's going to be this many draws. And then it would try to make up odds for draws and things like that. It's a knockout round. There's going to be a winner and a loser. There are no draws. I don't understand.
Yeah, it is weird because in many ways they talk about this stuff in a human-like way or narrate their thoughts in that way. But often they have a mix of failures that feel very human-like. They fail to compare numbers that are in different numerical formats, so scientific notation versus decimal sometimes. They just make mistakes sometimes about this one 10 to the second versus whatever, which of these two is going to be larger. I saw something in a paper about models getting confused whether a number that ends in 0.08 is larger than a number that ends in 0.11. I don't know, because 8 feels like it's bigger than 1, even though. So in some ways, these are very human mistakes. Or they'll narrate things like, I want to double check this because it's easy to get these kind of things wrong. But it is very strange because then they do make mistakes that are just fundamentally different from the way that human beings operate. There was a good paper from a couple months ago about how models have the almost inverted Benford's law problem, where traditionally a number of different types of data follow what's called Benford's law, where they have a distribution of digits that's higher for the smaller digits. So numbers will start with a lot more ones or have a lot more ones in them than they will nines, for instance, because you have to double something to get it from 1 to 2, and you only have to increase by 1/9 to get from 9 to 10, which starts you at a 1 again. And because the models are trained on all this historic data, they have a really high preference for picking values and generating values that have low digits in them. So they sort of adhere to this when it's not really correct, but human beings are really bad at naturally doing this. So this is one way you can catch people committing check fraud and stuff like that, is that the stuff they submit is not distributed in this way.
Yeah, it's a really interesting property that I think has been kicking around for a while as we sort of understand how human numerical fluency works and the limitations in our inductive biases for these things as humans, and then seeing this very anthropomorphic technology, which in many ways is really just doing this statistical association. These seem like the plausible numbers and how they should relate to each other, where you can find that they're not in fact doing basic arithmetic and can fail on incredibly trivial low-level calculations if you pass them to an LLM to do a thing that like 20 lines of calculator code could do correctly. But this warehouse-size intelligence does wildly incorrectly. I think it's a deceptive, ragged frontier that I think is likely having all sorts of impact on things like the enormous failure rate of AI projects and enterprise automation. Is that what people are actually doing is throwing something that's business-critical math or something like that to a model that like sounds like a customer service agent, but couldn't actually get out of elementary school math, which is really wild.
What is especially bizarre about this is that when you give models the correct sort of tools and the correct framework, when you make models write mathematics in Lean and so that they can fully check their own work. In the past couple of weeks, mostly GPT, but a little bit Fable, have produced counterexamples to conjectures that have been open for 60 to 100 years and verified their work, or have been proving major open questions or disproving major open conjectures in math. So when you give them these frameworks where they're constrained and where they can verify their own work fully, they can do all this kind of crazy math and reasoning. But when you just ask them to multiply numbers or compare values without any sort of framework, they just cannot do it.
Yeah, I think it's part of the increasing complexity of having strong intuitions about what works in what manner of deploying current generation AI towards some of these numerically and mathematically rich problems, that we see this huge mismatch in terms of abilities based on the approach you take. For folks who maybe haven't heard me talk about this before, back in the day, I was at Facebook AI Research, and one of the teams I supported was doing some of the early work around theorem proving. This is the team that ultimately went on to build the Llama model, and some went on to then do things like create Mistral. And in those early days, we were just scratching at the surface of things, but it was clear that here was some of the hardest intellectual labor that humans could ever put together, and we definitely know the right answer to. This is really, really hard. It requires very deep experts, and we're able to start to get models to do a little bit of it by teaching it frameworks like Lean, that just being able to tie up to this huge body of encoded human intelligence about the rich domain of mathematics, and then getting it to work within that constrained framework, you can make progress at all. Now the bar is so high to where we're looking at people shooting for what is effectively Fields medal type work with these fantastically large models, and really trying to meaningfully extend the horizon of human knowledge around one of the extremely abstract domains. It's really fascinating that it's tractable, but then it seems so incredibly unsolved when the average scenario is something simple as obviously wrong. It's just asking an LLM to pick a number between 1 and 10, because you'll see this weird chat version of Benford's law. See how many times you get a 10. It really hates to say 10. Really, really hates it. It won't say it, even though that's a number between 1 and 10. It's a strange thing. So it's possible to have constraints. It's possible to make these models reason given supporting infrastructure. For folks who are not expert in stuff like Lean, it's probably worth talking about what is Lean and why does it work, but then also just what are all the different ways at which you could make a model know any of these things that it's getting wrong, whether it's that sort of magnitude, disfluency, or anything else.
So Lean is a math formalization framework. It is a programming language, but it is primarily designed to formalize and verify mathematical statements. So there is a built-in library that a community maintains of pre-existing math implications, statements, theorems, things like that you can use to build on top of. And then also it provides a way for you to make or attempt to make arbitrary statements about things in mathematics and then prove that they hold in a first order logical framework. Depending on the kind of mathematics you want to do, some of it is relatively amenable to stating this way. Some of it requires a huge amount of additional work, but it's been used in a lot of the recent sort of LLMs doing pure mathematics work because, unsurprisingly, people are sort of distrustful of the LLM generated proof. And so if you can get the model to convert that into, a sequence of statements, all of which you can prove follow one another, then you can verify that what they've done is correct. There are a whole range of formal verification programs, frameworks, capabilities like Boolean solvers and SMT solvers that can verify algebraic statements or statements about bounded numerical operations. It depends what you're trying to say. Lean is not really designed for making claims about programs or program functions. It's really focused on pure mathematics.
Yeah, well, I draw one little connection there that I think might be interesting for some of the software engineering-minded audience out there is that Lean is the basis by which we, these days, encode things like programming language theory and type systems and so forth, which rests on this bit of knowledge called the Curry-Howard isomorphism, which basically says there's this join point where you could say that what we mean within this aspect of programming language theory is fully equivalent. It is exactly the same thing written differently as this other part of mathematics. And I think that's part of this broader move to revisit everything going on in formal methods as a way of realizing that they create a sort of mech suit for all of the deficiencies of current gen LLMs. If you have a good sound substrate to verify your reasoning, you can know what's right and wrong and guide these otherwise untrustworthy LLMs towards knowing if they're right or wrong. There's also more prosaic stuff. We talked about in this chat all the things the models get wrong on really, really basic stuff about soccer betting and things like that. Truly unit test level things, as well as things that sit somewhere in between. They're not the most advanced abstract mathematics, but they're also known to be true within a domain. I think you had some interesting results there where you saw that there were ways you could bring the horse to water and actually see it drink.
So we did do some work around if you give the models tooling access to some of these formal methods like SMT solvers or bounded propagation solvers, things that can tell you deterministically about what properties your function that you just wrote has and where they're observed, or if there are counterexamples when you say my betting model is only going to produce probability values, and sometimes or things between 0 and 1, and sometimes it produces a 2. These kind of tools sort of can show you, okay, here's the actual counterexample, here's the input that will produce a 2 on your function that's supposed to only produce values between 0 and 1. So we did see that if we provide the models with some of these things via tools or via Shellis, our programming framework, that they do actually use them and they can apply them and they will actually use them to check their own work. So on some level, they know that they need to check their work and they're not that good at it. They just don't often have the tool to do that for themselves or to do that in a holistic way that doesn't depend on them like reasoning about whether they have tested it correctly. And you can see this in a much smaller version if you just ask a model some numeric questions like which of these two numbers is bigger if one of them is in scientific notation. If you ask Gemini this, it will inevitably write a Python script to compute them both to decimals so it can compare. It has some level of knowledge that I'm just not that good at these kind of things, so I should use some external tooling. It's just once you start to get more complicated programs and more complicated sort of numerical frameworks, things like, yeah, I just wrote it down in Python, don't really sort of continue to work in that way.
Yeah, it works really powerfully for those sort of simple one-offs comparisons where you're relying upon standard library calls. And then, as we always do, we always create more problems for ourselves by having higher and higher ambitions for the sophistication of reasoning we want. A real world production code base of 100,000 or 1 million or 10 million lines of code has all sorts of comparisons that are really not a few lines of Python. They're quite a lot more to think about if you really want to know how they're going to behave. I think one thing that your recollection there reminds me of is the beginning episode of this series when we talked to Ross Taylor about whether Kelly Bench is a benchmark of models or of agents. And he strongly asserts that the model should at least know that it should be doing things like backtesting. It should be doing things like Kelly staking. But you really, really can see this gulf where almost all the model providers have realized that to push the next generation of capabilities, you must agentify them. You must provide good tools that know things about what is good behavior, like how to do a comparison in a Python script, and then go forth and use that to extend out the reliability. That you're just not going to get the correct answer to be spat out of the LLM directly. But what you can do is you can train LLMs and these sort of run books to figure out how do I build a program that solves this for me. And it certainly seems like that's where the ball's moved if you look at where pretty much all the teams are spending their time. And I think it also has really interesting projections for what it means in the future if you think about how do you build the right sort of cache knowledge, the right sort of understanding of what exactly is true about your domain, like things like you're probably never going to score 20 goals in a World Cup final. There is no draw in the knockout round. Things like that, being able to pull them in from cache knowledge that allow you to never write the wrong program. Start to look really attractive because the authorship of programs in the middle, that's become so cheap and fast. It's the knowing that it's the correct one, knowing that it didn't do all these stupid mistakes, that ends up being the expensive and the hard part. And I think it gets really promising if you can find ways to do that really effectively, that make these smart models actually do the right things and behave as if they are as smart as they could be in some of these cases where we see the early signs with things like lean.
Yes, that is sort of the dual edge, right? Is if you need to know that your program is actually doing the things it's supposed to do and it's working correctly and it's outputting the correct type of values in the correct range and it has the correct domain and all of that stuff. But as people agentify their programming and their workloads more, you also have issues where the model's priors for what this domain looks like is not good. And so, sure, the function does exactly what the model thinks it does, but if you don't have that domain knowledge, or if your model doesn't have that domain knowledge to pull from, then it's writing a function that's primarily scoped over like the wrong distribution or the wrong game or the wrong sort of baseline understanding of what's supposed to happen and where we are.
Yeah, we start to think about real work inside real companies. Every company is in a very specific line of business. They know some very specific things that are true about their products, their customers, the legal regulations they live underneath. All those things are kind of enterprise specific, and you're just not going to get them off the shelf. And so it's just a new priority for software development investment in an age of agentic coding. You simply need to be able to encode your domain knowledge into a different sort of package to enable the agents to actually serve your business the way it needs to. Alrighty, so as we steer towards the end here, I note that despite the trend, we didn't actually give ourselves a hydration break. And so before we wrap up, just take a quick moment, hydrate, make sure that you feel loose, and get to the end without any injuries. Maybe we can serve an ad.
This is where you show the Polymarket odds.
Sadly, this channel is not yet sponsored by anyone formally. Mm-hmm. I've made the occasional pitch. If Lucky Saint wants to sponsor me, I'm happy to put them on every single video. Just send the cans direct to my door. Alrighty, folks. So this is a look back over kind of gym class and math class in one. In a weird combination, but I hope it was informative for folks who wanted to think about both how does a tournament play out and then how can we predict some of that stuff and what does that mean about the state of current Gen AI. So before we close out, I'm going to ask us to do one more data science projection task to make one prediction about the next World Cup. You have very, very little data to work from here. I haven't given people any time to do a back test, pull in your data. Naz, I'll start with you. What's your prediction for the next World Cup? You can predict a winner, predict something else?
I must say England. Norway and England.
Is that your final? Is Norway and England?
Yeah, I think either one of those could win. They could be in the top 10 for sure, my guess at the moment. Any other team, I really wouldn't care.
All right, those are some predictions. Robert, you got any predictions for next World Cup?
I think Cote d'Ivoire is going all the way.
Okay, really going for those long outs.
Their year, yeah. I put $100,000 on it on Polymarket already, so they got to do well.
That'd be one way to do it. All right, I'm going to do a different sort of prediction, which is 2030 World Cup will break records for the absolute hottest day in which a World Cup game has ever been played. That's my bet. I'm cheating a little bit, but I'm gonna bet on that one. I don't think I'm gonna get good poly market outs on that one though. Alrighty, folks, thanks very much for joining us through this exploration of some World Cup stuff, a little bit of AI stuff. I guess we're gonna call this iterative refinement. And on behalf of Naz and Robert, I would thank you for time and listening to us today. Be well, folks. Bye bye.